What is gender? It differs depending on who you ask. While sex and gender have often been used to refer to the same thing, it is important to make the distinction that sex does not equal gender. Despite prevalent ideas in society, gender does not always fall into a male or female binary, and in rare cases, sex doesn't either. If you're feeling a little lost, let's define some of these terms. Though frequently interchanged in some speech and writing, sex and gender have two distinct meanings. Sex refers to the external genitalia and internal reproductive organs. In this context, gender refers to one's role in society, self-perception, presentation, and/or self-identity. Most people are assigned male or female at birth, but not everyone will identify with this later on in life. We must also make this distinction. Sexual orientation and gender are not the same thing. Gender is your personal identity, while your orientation is who you are romantically or sexually attracted to. Transgender is an umbrella term for anyone who does not identify as their birth gender. There are many terms used by individuals who fall outside the gender binary to refer to themselves. A few are non-binary, agender, and genderqueer. These people do not exclusively identify as male or female. In this video, we will explore how language, specifically the Spanish language, impacts cultural attitudes towards LGBTQ people.
First, let's give some background on why English is not a gendered language. The English language was not always a gender-neutral language like it is in today's society. English was a gendered language in the 1200s. The English-speaking people at this time spoke a form called Old English. This branch used the feminine and masculine articles se and seo. However, the Vikings spoke a different branch off of modern-day English called Old Norse. Old Norse used different feminine and masculine articles in their language that contradicted those of Old English. When the Vikings invaded parts of England, the languages gradually mixed, and in order to simplify things, people just stopped using feminine and masculine articles altogether.
Almost every word in Spanish is gendered, ending either in O, which is masculine, or A, which is feminine. Adjectives can either have an O or an A on the end, depending on if the person being described is a male or female, but there is no proper way to describe someone who is genderqueer. For example, to describe a group of people as they, Spanish has ellos, which means they or them pertaining to a group of males or a group of people of mixed gender, and ellas, which is they or them pertaining to a group of females. Additionally, él is used to say he, and ella is used to say she. In the U.S., they or them is typically used to describe a person who identifies as non-binary, but in Spanish, the ways to say they or them are still gendered terms, which can leave non-binary people feeling like there is no proper way for others to identify them. In more recent years, people have begun to add an E to the end of words describing non-binary people in place of an O or an A. For example, instead of él, ella, ellos, or ellas, it would be ella or ellas. Although this is a start, it is still not universally used or technically part of the Spanish language, so it is not taught. In 2007, Spain passed the Gender Identity Law, which allowed people to change the gender marker in the civil registry if it did not match the person's assigned gender without requiring surgery. This is a step in the right direction, but there are still restrictions. For example, they must have gone through at least 2 years of hormonal treatment, are of consenting age, and require a doctor's diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Requiring a diagnosis of gender dysphoria sends the message that transgender or non-binary people have a disease, which is something that advocates are working on changing in Spain.
Mexico abolished most discriminatory legal distinctions based on sexual orientation long before the United States. Mexico decriminalized sodomy in 1871, more than 100 years before the U.S. Supreme Court overturned anti-sodomy laws in 2003. In 2003, the Mexican Chamber of Deputies unanimously passed a national anti-discrimination law that included sexual orientation as a protected category, established a new agency to enforce the anti-discrimination law, and developed a national anti-homophobia campaign. Moreover, the first article in the Mexican Constitution prohibits discrimination based on sexual preferences. In many ways, however, the law has not been effectively implemented in Mexico. The state agents use violence in ways that are not authorized by the law. Individual state actors have used state violence against sexual minorities, often with impunity. While the law is not always effectively enforced in Mexico, the law does not allow for legal discrimination of sexual minorities. An important explanation for Mexico's advances in gay rights is its recent transition to democracy. In a new democracy, struggling to overcome the legacies of authoritarian rule, human rights have more prominence, and therefore there may be greater consensus on the importance of protecting the human rights of all people. However, there is still room for improvement, as same-sex marriage is still only legal in Mexico City and in 13 of the 31 Mexican states.
Honduras is a country in the southern tail of Latin America, and contrasting with Spain and Mexico, it is extremely violent towards the LGBTQ community. 26 queer individuals were killed in 2018, and over one-fourth of those people were transgender. Some of these murders have been overtly transphobic, involving dismemberment of genitalia and other such horrifying acts. According to a Berkeley Law article, El Salvador is also a very discriminatory place for LGBTQ individuals, with many people believing the police to be dismissive and at times directly violent towards transgender individuals in particular. One person mentioned that they filed a police report and after walking away, turned around and saw the police officer ripping up the form and throwing it in the garbage. Another person discussed the discrimination toward them from healthcare professionals as well, saying that they generalized the entire community, believing all of them to have HIV and being cruel and dismissive. Overall, it continues to be a blatantly transphobic community. In 1 year, there were 2,230 alleged complaints against the police, with 545 of those reported complaints being about sexual or physical violence towards the transgender community. It's important to consider also how many people didn't even report the misconduct, that this is just a tiny fraction of all the people being invalidated and discriminated against. The LGBTQ community in El Salvador know that the police don't take them seriously, and it is likely that a huge amount of people don't even bother reporting anymore because it isn't worth their time. Panama is definitely an easier place to be queer, but it's nowhere near perfect. In January of 2018, the Inter-American Court System made a ruling allowing for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights, and Panama was one of the first countries to comply. Both the Vice President and the First Lady of Panama are strong proponents of LGBTQ rights, but unfortunately, same-sex marriage is still not legal in any Latin American country. The three countries that I have discussed have extremely different societies outside of the viewpoints on LGBTQ rights, but it is all interconnected. In El Salvador, one of the most overpopulated countries in the region, there is an abundance of gang violence and theft and murder, with people constantly trying to emigrate and leave their unsafe living conditions in a violent and overcrowded country. This clearly shows through in their police negligence, brutality, and the repression of the LGBTQ community. Honduras is in a similar boat to El Salvador, however, it is much larger and much less densely populated. El Salvador has 785 people living per square mile, while Honduras has 212 people living per square mile, which makes it about 3.7 times less densely populated than El Salvador. This is probably a reason it has a lower statistic of violence than El Salvador as well. Panama, on the other hand, is entirely different. It has a lower population and tends to be a place where people are more content, and it has the lowest rate of emigration to the U.S. of any of the Latin American countries. According to Alex Orellana, a Salvadorian man we interviewed, people seem much happier there compared to El Salvador, while prices and immigration remain just as low.
Argentina's gender identity law was passed in 2012 that made it the only country at the time to allow people to change their gender identities without having to go through hurdles such as surgery, psychiatric diagnosis, or hormone therapy. Despite this, the police still criminalize transgender people with arbitrary detentions on the street. Gender-neutral language is up and coming, but is still only used by youth and still receives backlash by traditionalists. Many traditionalists do not care to learn something new because they believe it is the way it is. The masculine O is now being replaced with a neutral E. One girl explains to her teacher how she began using les and todes in the classroom to be more inclusive. In Chile, a young transgender girl, Sophia, was struggling to explain why this issue is important and not everyone is understanding. The head of Chile's Catholic Church, Cardinal Ricardo Ezzati, said that children should not be able to legally change their name and sex on their ID, arguing that a cat will not become a dog just because I give it a dog's name. This quote is from an article telling people about Sophia's journey and how not everyone will ever fully accept her. One man said that the rights were excluded from transgender people in Chile and are being acknowledged last. The gender identity law took effect in 2018, which allows transgender people at the age of 14 to update their legal documents and guarantees the right to be addressed as such. Even though this is taken into effect, many still believe that the rights for transgender people in Chile are acknowledged last. Some would come to the U.S. in order to escape violence and death threats for being a part of the LGBTQ community. There are no public policies or laws protecting trans people. The policies that do exist are binary and do not take into account the diversity of transgender identities. As for gender-neutral language, it is becoming more and more common throughout South America in order to become more inclusive for all gender identities.
In comparing the laws and cultural beliefs of these different Spanish-speaking countries, it is interesting to see the pattern with their views towards LGBTQ acceptance. It is easy to conclude from these findings that in recent years especially, people of the LGBTQ community are more accepted than they have been in the past. There are a multitude of ways to reference their preferred title. They are recognized by the community as people instead of shamed for who they are. With the Spanish-speaking countries only having 2 articles to describe a man and a woman, it at first glance could be perceived that people in Spanish-speaking countries are more judgmental than people in gender-neutral speaking countries, such as the United States. However, based on our research, this is not the case. Countries mentioned previously, such as Spain, Argentina, and Chile, have laws allowing for people to freely and legally change their gender to what they feel and believe. However, not all Spanish-speaking countries do this, such as El Salvador, with brutal and violent beliefs towards anyone in the LGBTQ community. This inconsistency highlights the fact that the gendered language has little to do with the acceptance of LGBTQ community. Some countries are very welcoming, and some are savage towards these people.